What came first? An egg or a chicken? What came first? The Resident Evil movie or game? Congratulations, you have successfully passed the Resident Evil fan test. Of course, all fans of the series know that the films have little to do with the game that was released back in 1996. Just think, for 27 years, the Resident Evil series of games lives and thrives, delighting millions of gamers around the world. But the story of Raccoon City was born in those days when Capcom was not the most successful Japanese studio. However, it was the Resident Evil who changed its fate forever. Today, this story has grown into 36 games, 7 films, 7 books by S.D. Perry, and all kinds of merch. Today, we will start to remember the path of the Resident Evil series, in which we are going to plunge into the origins of the Umbrella Corporation, find out who created the T-Virus, why there are so many doors in the game, what does Sylvester Stallone have to do with it, and much more. And then we'll look at all the ups and downs in the sequels and remakes of the game. We'll cry, laugh, and get nostalgic. Well, let's start today with the first part of the series. You are watching PressX. Get comfortable. We're getting started.
Resident Evil.
It is worth saying that the roots of the game date back to the 80s, and it is likely that many are not familiar with them. In those years, games looked a little different. They were hardcore platformers that made the player constantly be in motion, and during its passing, it developed a certain skill for the player to correctly press the buttons. But most importantly, they had an exciting atmosphere. Behind all brilliant ideas are equally brilliant people, or other brilliant ideas. The idea of Resident Evil has not fallen from the sky and hasn't come out of nowhere, but goes back to 1989 and owes to one creative developer with the nickname Professor F. In those years, game designer Takura Fujiwara stood behind many breakthrough projects, although he got into the world of video games by accident. Fujiwara studied at the Osaka College of Design when he joined Konami in 1982. He was interested in a product planner job that the company had at the time and didn't even know Konami made video games until he passed the entrance exam. At the same time, he had experience as an artist in such things as flyers and acrylic boards for board games. At Konami, he directed 2 games, Puyan and Rock 'n' Rope, which in turn was the first game he developed from scratch. But he did not stay long at Konami, and in 1983, he joined Capcom. This was where he became a real success. For example, Takuro is best known for creating the iconic Ghosts and Goblins series, and also briefly produced the Mega Man series and other Capcom franchises. At one point, he decided to make a horror film for Capcom where he had been working for over 10 years. It was a play adaptation of the horror movie Sweet Home. Although the opposite is more correct, because it was the film directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa that was released as an addition to the survival horror about a company of filmmakers who dared to enter the old abandoned mansion of a famous artist to photograph his work. Well, who would have thought that this would turn out to be a bad idea? The heroes were trapped with mystical opponents and made to join efforts in order to simply stay alive. By the way, the film director also took part in the game development. The game had several possible endings. Probably you already noticed the similarity with the topic of today's video, but when you find out what the essence of the game was, then all the questions would disappear. The player had to navigate through a tangled mansion, switch between 5 playable characters, and fight enemies with a limited number of weapons and health items available. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? The game hasn't been released anywhere outside of Japan, so you probably haven't heard of it, but it was a real sensation and an absolutely unique project which Fujiwara still considers one of his favorites, especially taking into account everything that Fujiwara and Capcom released in those years. Fujiwara's latest contribution to Capcom would be producing the first installment in the Resident Evil series. Inspired by his own horror film Sweet Home, Fujiwara defined elements such as the game's setting for the future project and improved the transition from first person to third person, leaving all the actual development to the young game planner Shinji Mikami. The Japanese game designer Shinji Mikami wanted to keep the haunted house style with cinematic techniques and a dark soundtrack by composer Junko Tamiya, but make the sequel more successful. He didn't care that Shinji had a diploma in merchandising. By the way, unlike Takuro, he could not get a job at the company at all. There were about 50 candidates in the developer interview at Capcom, and Shinji was among those who were supposed to be rejected.
で人事の方から以上の名前呼ばれた方はご縁がなかったと思ってお一人お願いしますって言ってでまあ落とされた。でダメだなと思ってた1週間後にその その会社から電話がかかってきて、手違いがあってやっぱり内定ですんでやっぱり来てくださいと。でもよくわからない、なんでかよくわかんなくて。
As a result, only a year later, Shinji learned that he did poorly on a written test before the interview, on the basis of which he should have been rejected. But the company management and Fujiwara insisted on hiring him and other developers. Mikami had been doing a good job of working on games for Disney projects for several years, but Takuro wanted to see how talented that newcomer was and entrusted him to develop a horror game based on the mechanics of Sweet Home. The first time when my boss asked me to make a horror game, he ordered me to use the Sweet Home mechanics and apply them to something else, to make a horror game. So that was an order. The project was named Psycho by Shinji, but was criticized by Capcom management for refusing to play in the script, feeling that the story interfered with gameplay. Making changes to Sweet Home, Mikami, with Takuro Fujiwara, gradually created a completely different game. Mikami completely disassembled the Fujiwara game to create his own and lay the foundations of the survival horror genre for years to come. And it was Shinji who should have been thanked for what the first Resident Evil turned out to be and what he would turn the series into in the future. But first things first. More than 2 years passed by. The game was released on the PlayStation, a new 32-bit system capable of handling polygonal graphics and large projects. However, the technical component of Capcom's games in those years was strictly classified and remained unknown until the mid-2000s. As a result, a lot of misinformation about the Resident series is still circulating on the internet. For example, there is information that it has been created on the Quake engine. How do you like that? According to Mikami,
一番最初の企画ってファーストパーソンだったんですよ。バイオハザード1は。やっぱ怖いのはこうだっていうとこからそういう企画で、進めてたんですけど、当時カプコンの中で 3D って未経験で、僕が思ったようなビジュアルが画面上に全く出なかったんですよね。で、このままいったらこれペンディングになっちゃうぞ。
The game designer got acquainted with Alone in the Dark, released in 1992, and in fact, thanks to Alone in the Dark, Mikami decided to make a game from a third person. Coming out in 1996, the game was called, no, not Resident Evil, but Biohazard. In their home country of Japan, Resident Evil games are still titled Biohazard. Maybe the developers just label a harmful plastic box. Anyway, such a sonorous name turned out to be rather secondary. The thing is, in America, this name already belonged to the forgotten DOS game, which is ridiculous, and the New York hardcore punk band Biohazard, which is cool. It was impossible to release the game on the American market under an identical name. After some consideration, they chose a new name, now familiar to everyone: Resident Evil. The history of Umbrella dates back to the 1960s when the head of the aristocratic Ashford house, Edward Ashford, conducted research and came to the hypothesis of the existence of a virus that accelerated evolution. This hypothesis was supported by two of Edward's close friends, the aristocrat Oswell E. Spencer and the respected biochemist and virologist James Marcus. In September 1966, they stumbled upon an abstract by a geographer and naturalist Henry Travis, in which he described the unique properties of an African flower that the Indapaya locals called Stairway to the Sun and used in their rituals. Edward and his friends were soon ready for an expedition to West Africa to find a plant. They arrived in the city of Kijuju, where they entered an isolated cave system leading to the ancient underground city of Indapaya. There, they managed to find a mysterious flower, but after conducting research on December 4, 1966, it turned out that the flower was a carrier of an infection that was still unknown to the world. They called a virus that could change the structure of DNA progenitor and took samples with them to the United States for detailed study. With the help of the progenitor, it was planned to eradicate diseases and even accelerate human evolution. However, during the research, Ashford discovered the inefficiency of the virus. The genes of modern organisms could not be adapted. Sometime later, Ashford took charge of the T-virus project, developing an improved version of the progenitor virus. The new type of biological weapon was given the name BOW, Bioorganic Weapons. However, at the same time, Oswell E. Spencer, secretly from his colleagues, hatched a plan in his head how humanity could be enslaved with the help of a virus. He wanted to use the new development for military purposes. To do this, he built a secret underground laboratory in his mansion near Raccoon City. At this point, it's worth referring to the story that appeared in the guidebook that came out in addition to the game in 1997. It told the story about the architect George Trevor in the form of his notes, which were removed from the game a couple of months before its release. In October 1967, George Trevor received a thank you letter from one of his wealthy clients, Lord Spencer, who commissioned Trevor to design a unique mansion in the Arklay Mountains near Raccoon City. After the work was done, Lord Spencer personally invited Trevor to visit the house with his entire family as a sign of friendship and gratitude. George accepted the invitation but was made to stay late, and his wife and daughter arrived at the mansion earlier. After a couple of days, George also arrived at the mansion, but it turned out that they missed each other as they were made to leave earlier. For a long time, there was no word from the family, and the architect panicked. Overhearing Spencer's unwanted conversation with some red-haired scientist, Trevor was thrown into a dark basement with palm-sized spiders all over the place. He managed to escape, but for a long time he was wandering underground tunnels under the mansion, where terrible monsters were teeming. The basement became the architect's grave. Or, on the other hand, his wife died even more terribly. Jessica Trevor and her daughter Lisa Trevor became Spencer's first subjects to test new strains of the virus on. Jessica did not survive the strain A virus, but Lisa was injected with the type B strain and there were positive results observed in her body. This was the fact that prompted Spencer planning to monopolize the military market. The city-forming factor in Raccoon City was the pharmaceutical corporation Umbrella, founded 32 years before the events of the game. Although the roots of the corporation lay much deeper, but more on that another time. Keeping his plan a secret from his colleagues, Spencer, with James Marcus and Edward Ashford, organized a company that was supposed to serve as a cover for Spencer's research. Almost every second inhabitant of the 100,000th city worked in this company in one way or another. The Umbrella Corporation was researching the biological species of the local flora and using some of the plants to create medicines, and the research results instantly made the corporation a leader in the pharmaceutical market, guaranteed economic success, and strengthened its political influence. Umbrella set up a separate training center to train future employees. James Marcus was appointed director of the center, while Spencer and Ashford remained at the head of the corporation itself. Over time, the stocks of the ancestors began to run out, and Oswell sent soldiers to Africa on a mission to seize their territory from the Ndpaya tribe. He planned to build an underground laboratory directly on the site of ancient ruins with flowers. And in order to strengthen his control over the corporation, Spencer faked the death of Ashford, infecting him with the progenitor. Initially, Edward had a significant advantage over the other co-founders due to the contributions made to the T-Virus project. At first, he did joint research on the virus with his son, Alexander. However, his son soon gave up research when he realized that he lacked experience. In 1969, having chosen the path of genetic engineering, he began to work on the Code Veronica project. We'll talk about this in more detail another time. After Edward's death, Alexander Ashford was forced to take his place in the company. Edward's work continued to be appreciated even after his death, and his absence was strongly felt every time research in the Arklay lab was coming to a standstill. Spencer's influence grew every day, and his son's failure to follow the example of Edward Ashford led to a decline in the status of their family, destroying almost everything that his father had created. Simultaneously, Oswell launched his secret project to create a race of superhumans called Project Wesker. All his life, he cherished the dream of immortality and an ideal world in which there was no place for second-class people. This project was supposed to be the first step towards realizing the dream of a new world order, and its title, Project Wesker, was named after the head of the study. Hundreds of children around the world were selected for research whose parents had an extremely high level of intelligence, after which they all received the name Wesker. Thanks to the secret help of the corporation, the children received the best education in their chosen field. Albert was one of those children. Being selected for the program, Albert stood out among other children, which made Umbrella founder Oswell Spencer very happy. He saw in Albert those inclinations that the rest of the project participants did not have. It's not surprising that under the watchful eye of his creator, remaining in the dark about Spencer's intentions and his origins, Albert became not just an employee of the corporation that raised him, but also one of its most promising Padawans.
You were the chosen one! It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them!
As a 17-year-old student, Albert was sent to study at the Umbrella Training Center where he met promising student William Birkin, as future friend, rival, and colleague for many years to come. The head of the center, James Marcus, considered them both to be his best students and the only ones he could trust. Soon, Marcus managed to discover a way to create a T-virus by crossing the progenitor with leech DNA. From that moment on, he began to experiment on his subordinates, turning them into zombies. And when the complex was closed on July 29, 1978, Albert and William were transferred to the Arklay Underground Laboratories, appointing them as chief scientists. Umbrella Corporation was conducting a series of illegal experiments in a secret laboratory, and the result of their activities was a highly infectious and mutagenic biological agent known as the T-virus. And all living beings and insects that came into contact with it were affected by it and mutated. Those infected with the T-virus became cruel and hungry zombie-like creatures and were forced to constantly attack other living organisms. And the strain of the virus allowed the body to function after death. The mere thought of this caused Spencer to become paranoid, and he rightly suspected Marcus of wanting to take his place. And that's why he decided to close the training center and transfer employees to his laboratories. The research at the Arklay lab hit a dead end when Birkin discovered that 10% of the planet's inhabitants were immune to the T-virus. Birkin's research did not yield results until 1981, when he was able to develop a new type of bioorganic weapon, the Hunter. He decided to cross the DNA of the reptile with a fertilized human egg, which had been infected with the T-virus. A human-like reptile with developed muscles, could move fast, but was absolutely not developed intellectually. It should have read books, but instead, the Umbrella Corporation simply launched a new project, Nemesis, with the goal of creating samples of organic weapons already with a similar human intellect and physically superior to humans. In 1988, William completed the creation of a bioorganic weapon called the Tyrant, a super soldier with high immunity to pain, physical strength, and intelligence. And after Birkin and Wesker helped Spencer kill his mentor, James Marcus, which gave William the opportunity to continue the doctor's research work, he was promoted and appointed head of the T-virus research project. Marcus's body was dumped into the sewers, and his DNA was merged with a leech he experimented on before his death. Who would have thought that this pleasant surprise would bring Marcus back to life? Meanwhile, Birkin in the laboratory used Lisa Trevor as a guinea pig and introduced the Nemesis alpha parasite into her body. Lisa was the only person who survived the parasite implantation. The other test subjects died shortly after. Drawing attention to her phenomenal viability, William Birkin conducted research and found out that one of the variations of the progenitor virus, introduced to the girl back in 1967, absorbed all the mutagenic organisms implanted in her since that time. And the progenitor, in 21 years, transformed into a new strain called Birkin's Golgotha, or simply the G-virus. Lisa's mind was partially restored, but her body mutated, growing awful tentacles on her back. William received permission from Umbrella Corporation President Oswell Spencer to start research on the G-virus. However, Wesker did not approve that. The fact is that unlike the T-virus, that one caused random and uncontrolled mutations in the infected, turning them into terrible monsters that were not very suitable for creating bioorganic weapons. By that time, William had been married for a long time to Annette Birkin, a colleague of a scientist from the corporation, and they had a daughter, Sherry Birkin. Research on the G-virus was moved to a large new research facility called NEST, built specifically for the study of the G-virus and located right below Raccoon City. In 1991, Birkin and his wife were transferred to this underground laboratory, and to ensure the project's safety, William, through his wife, bribed Raccoon Police Chief Brian Irons. At some point, people began to die in the city's suburbs. Numerous bodies were found, and they were partially eaten. The police failed to investigate these events, and the case was entrusted to the STARS Special Forces Unit. A helicopter with the Bravo Squad was sent on a mission. However, when contact with Bravo Team had been lost, Alpha Team was sent to investigate their disappearance. Looks like it's time to get to know them better. On July 24, 1998, a series of bizarre murders took place on the outskirts of the Midwest industrial town of Raccoon City. The Raccoon City Police Department's STARS team, specially created to deal with the growing crime in the city, was tasked with investigating. The detachment consisted of two groups, Alpha and Bravo, assembled from outstanding representatives of their spheres. The town was small and could not maintain a special tactical detachment with taxpayers' money. However, it was gladly funded by a pharmaceutical corporation that felt it was its duty to protect the town's people, many of whom were its employees. The first playable character was Jill Valentine. She was 21 years old, daughter of a Frenchman and a Japanese woman. Specialization, rear support. She was invited to the squad by Albert Wesker thanks to her track record. Jill studied biochemistry and graduated from university at 17. She was the first woman in the U.S. Army who completed the 6-month intensive Delta Force training where she excelled in bomb disarming and lockpicking and was known for her fine but precise work, resilience, courage, and insight in facing danger. She liked to compete but was a caring team member. While serving in the U.S. Army, she met and became friends with Chris Redfield and Forrest Spire. It was Jill's friendship with Chris that became one of the key plot motifs of the entire series. Chris Redfield was the second playable character. He was 25 years old. Chris's parents died in a horrific car accident. The consequences of the disaster were so terrible that they could only be identified by dental record. Chris was a former U.S. Air Force pilot, but he was fired for dashing behavior and disobeying orders from his superiors when he thought he knew better. Then his friend and colleague Barry Burton invited him to join the STARS squad. He was the best shooter in the squad and helped improve Jill Valentine's shooting skills. The third member of the team was Barry Burton. He was 38 years old. He served in the U.S. Air Force with Chris, and after his dismissal, joined the Raccoon City Special Forces under the mentorship of Enrico Marini. During this time, he and his loving wife Katie had 2 daughters, Moira and Polly. Family was the most important thing in the world for him, and over time, Barry joined the newly formed STARS squad, where he invited his Army comrade Chris to join. Barry was the squad's weapons specialist and excellent shooter. Brad Vickers was a 35-year-old Alpha Team pilot. He had a timid and cowardly character. He knew his business well as a helicopter pilot, and besides that, he was a computer expert and had a specialization in chemical defense. The only question was how well Brad performed his role as a rear cover. Albert Wesker was the leader of Alpha Squad and captain of STARS. He was 38 years old. Considering that the desire to create STARS came from the Umbrella Corporation, it insisted on choosing Wesker's candidacy. An officer and a military doctor with a specialization in chemical military unit service. Albert even received seniority over the more respected captain Enrico Marini, who at the same time was given command of Bravo Squad. But it was again under the supervision of Albert Wesker, a balanced and prudent but cold and detached person. It was enough just to look into his eyes. They couldn't be seen behind the sunglasses, which he practically never took off, because from his youth he knew that whoever could look into his eyes could read one's intentions. Otherwise, one's companion would only know what one let them know. Rebecca Chambers was a young STARS newbie. She was an 18-year-old Bravo squad medic and a cover fighter. Rebecca was rightly considered a child prodigy because even at a young age, she entered the university and by the age of 18, she got her bachelor's degree with honors in chemistry. Thus, Rebecca attracted the attention of the Umbrella Corporation and received an invitation from her to work in the company. She was not particularly interested in the invitation, but her desire to help people led her to STARS, which was also sponsored by the corporation. So we can say that the corporation still got their hands on Rebecca, and she, still not really familiar with the entire Alpha Squad, made her first mission flight at the beginning of the game. Her hobbies included rooting for the local Raccoon City football team, as well as playing basketball since her youth. Enrico Marini was Bravo team captain and STARS vice captain after Albert Wesker. He was 41 years old. He served in the Army for a long time and proved himself well. He joined the law enforcement authorities and became a friend and mentor to Barry Burton. Thanks to private initiatives to protect the city, the Umbrella Corporation managed to attract Enrico Marini to the STARS squad, but as you know, the captain status was not given to him. Joseph Frost was the newest member of the squad. He was 27 years old, but nothing was known about Frost's life except that he was known for his extreme curiosity, love of danger, sense of humor, and optimism. He was a firearms specialist and technician and was qualified in the handling of hazardous materials. Frost was put in charge of updating and maintaining the STARS Alpha team with those skills. He was a daredevil and close friend of Chris Redfield and Forrest Spare, who raised concerns in emergencies due to his personality. Forrest Spare was 29 years old. He was top shooter on the Bravo team and challenger in this friendly competition with Chris Redfield. He was close friends with Chris and Jill, as they had known each other since the days of the Army service. Being a perfectionist and diligent in completing assigned tasks, he was also a cybersecurity supervisor. Richard Eichen was a 23-year-old Bravo communications specialist for the STARS team. A positive, sweet guy who, despite his relatively young age, was cool-headed and calm under pressure. The reason for this was the death of his younger sister from the hands of a criminal, which he had witnessed at a very young age. For many years, he was disturbed by a sense of guilt for what had happened and the thought that it should have been him instead of his sister. Kenneth J. Sullivan was 45 years old. He was the oldest member of the STARS squad. Sullivan was responsible for the intelligence and security positions of the Bravo team, although he had a PhD in chemistry. Therefore, Kenneth was personally selected by Albert Wesker in the detachment. In doing so, he continued wondering why him and why his scientific knowledge was necessary for the mission. Despite his insecurities, Sullivan's experience and precise research skills rivaled, if not surpassed, that of Captain Enrico Marini himself. Edward Dewey was a 26-year-old helicopter pilot who was the head pilot of the Bravo team. A sniper by profession, he worked as a rear guard. He generally looked after the junior team members, such as Rebecca Chambers, and was the team's auxiliary mechanic. During the game, it becomes known that the helicopter of the Bravo group has crashed. Alpha Team is attacked by angry infected dogs and forced to run headlong to the nearest hiding place, which turns out to be a mansion. From this moment, the game begins. The player has to fight various creepy creatures and eventually destroy the Umbrella Corporation laboratory. This incredible story was partly first revealed in a promo comic from Marvel to coincide with the game's 1996 release, but it didn't immediately begin to acquire details, backstories, and interesting facts. Therefore, you still haven't heard everything, but only the main part of the plot associated with the first Resident Evil. There are many more interesting plot twists ahead of us, but for now, it's time to tell you about the game's aspects. The games Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil presented the user with a rudimentary version of what is considered to be an open world in games today. Yes, of course, it was impossible to leave the mansion at the very beginning of the game, otherwise it would have simply destroyed the plot and the game itself. What's the point of wandering through rooms with zombies when you can just get out and go home? But even such a moment as a simple ban on leaving the mansion was played by the developers with a pack of dogs outside the doors when trying to leave the building. Furthermore, despite the loading between rooms, the player was in a single space with a clear structure and a map of the entire location. But at the same time, Resident Evil received the title of founder of the survival horror genre for one reason. The developers managed to convey the visual part of the project as close as possible to a real horror film, all thanks to the pre-rendering of the backgrounds. The space is still the same, just pre-prepared resources are used as a basis. This has simplified the game production, reduced the processing power and load consumption, allowing the console to process much more information. However, due to the CD speed limits, long black loading screens were formed, which they decided to stylize with creepy doors from Sweet Home. There were about 267 of them in the game, and the player never knew who or what was waiting for him behind the next door. It didn't solve the problem completely, but at that time, it was the best that developers could do in that situation. This stylistic decision entered the genre as a hallmark of the game. Yes, in some ports on consoles, the door animation could be skipped, but I think everyone will agree that a Resident Evil without doors is not a Resident Evil. Another crutch besides the doors, according to the developer, was the so-called tank control.
プリレンダで排気1枚にしたら十分いけるし、ただやっぱ難点はそのラジコン操作にならざるを得ない仕組みだったんで、そこはやっぱり発売日を迎えても解決することはできなかった。それが発売されてお客さんに支持されると、むしろあのラジコン操作が怖いっていうことにプラスになってると思いますっていうことをすごい言われて、すごく恥ずかしかったですね。未だにたまに言われますね。
In fact, the controls were tied to the orientation of the character, not the camera. In that case, the up button on the gamepad or keyboard moved the character forward and the right and left buttons turned him around. From the outside, it looked like an RC car. Such a scheme was criticized as uncomfortable and unnatural. In the real world, a person could move in any direction. However, in early games with frequent and player-independent changes in camera position, tank controls were relatively convenient because they allowed the player to maintain a sense of direction, regardless of where the camera was pointing at one time or another. Interestingly, in comparison with Sweet Home, the new studio project was much more elaborate and interesting. Even at the beginning of the game, the user was given the right to choose a game character. However, all the characters, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Rebecca Chambers, and Albert Wesker, were based on real actors who appeared in the cinematic. But wait a minute. Let's just call it a splash screen. And yet, for the mid-90s, its quality was excellent. Indeed, in the same year, Form Gen, for example, released a rather successful Duke Nukem 3D where there was no intro. And Nintendo had its own Super Mario 64. Although Nintendo is still doing this today, so forget the second example. The black and white intro was only in the censored American version where some frightening shots were specially cut out, and the game itself lost the auto-aim function. More on this later. In the Japanese version of Resident Evil, the splash screen was in color. By the way, the textures, backgrounds, and the entire environment were drawn by the artist Naoki Katakai. Thanks to him, many players got acquainted with the environment design familiar to them today. The choice of a playable character directly influenced the plot of the game and its ending, but the gameplay wasn't much different. You were exploring the area, solving all kinds of riddles, finding keys to doors and objects that you could twist to explore. Depending on the player's actions at key moments in the game, in the best-case scenario, your character was saving his partner. This was Rebecca Chambers in Chris's campaign, or Barry in Jill's campaign. You also rescued a team member imprisoned in the laboratory. It was Jill in Chris's campaign and vice versa. But you couldn't save a character from going through the campaign for another hero. Perhaps this was done on purpose so as not to destroy the integrity of the story, where you had saved the character before and then suddenly he appeared again. If at least your partner survived, then the main monster of the game was defeated and the mansion with the laboratory was destroyed. Otherwise, the ending was disappointing. At the same time, partners were needed not just to be around in the game. They had their own functions. Barry shared ammo with Jill and was able to protect her against monsters, and Rebecca, being a qualified doctor, could easily heal Chris from all illnesses. Jill and Chris had their own game advantages and their own unique weapons. You know how boys differ from girls? So, Chris had a flamethrower and Jill brandished a grenade launcher. The heroes begin their journey with a knife, the most useless weapon in the game. With a certain skill, they can kill zombies, but it is a certain death for beginners. Jill has a Beretta M92F pistol at the beginning of the game, but Chris will have to find it in the lobby of the mansion. The gun isn't bad, but it is rather weak, and it is better for the player to get a Remington M870 shotgun as soon as possible. In the second half of the game, the shotgun is the best friend for the player, especially at a short distance. Only the Colt Python can compare with the shotgun, although it has only 6 bullets in the clip, but it kills all enemies except the Tyrant with 1 shot. Yes, the bazooka was only available to Jill, but in the battle with the last boss, Brad Vickers drops an M66 rocket launcher from a helicopter to the player. This is a really scary weapon available to both characters. Everyone around dies with 1 accurate volley. The hunters actually can still have time to dodge, but these are trifles compared with such a gun. It can also be obtained by completing the game in less than 2.5 hours. In addition, as a bonus weapon, Jill could get an Ingram submachine gun, a kind of rapid-firing pistol that worked well on many enemies but had little killing power. And Chris got a Mini-Me automatic light machine gun. He did not have many differences with the pistol in power, but its high rate of fire allowed characters to resist even hunters, specially bred reptiles, as bioorganic weapons. Although they are one of the fastest and most dangerous opponents in the Resident Evil series of games. But the weapon is not the only thing that could be carried in the inventory. And if the player's character needed to restore health or be healed of poison, that could be done with the help of all the same plants that the Umbrella Corporation used in their medicines. They were of 3 colors: red, green, and blue. The player simply had to combine different types of plants in the inventory and get a drug with certain properties. Umbrella found that green grass by its properties restored physical strength, relieved fatigue, and increased the rate of wound healing, as well as helped to fight viral infections. Blue one neutralized toxins, and the most mysterious was the red grass, which had no medicinal properties. And so the botanists of the Umbrella Corporation engaged in the cultivation of herbs in order to create new types of drugs. It was found out by 1998. Red grass, when mixed with other species, enhances their effect. How can they be used by the player to heal? The combination of 2 green herbs gives a double effect of restoring health, but at the same time, by combining red with green, the player can completely heal health. So it makes sense to combine green with green only if it is very necessary and there is no red grass nearby. The combination of blue and green restores health and cures poison, and blue grass mixed with red completely eliminates the poison. Well, as you might have guessed, the combination of all 3 herbs has the most miraculous effect. It completely restores the player's health and heals them from the poison. The inventory, by the way, was limited, and unfortunately it would not work to carry an ancient Nord battle axe, dragon bones, 3 sets of armor, and 25 plant species. Therefore, universal chests were placed in the mansion, allowing you to put all your junk into it and get it from there when you need it. Truth be told, this could only be done from the save room. Yes, there was a separate room for this, and it was impossible to save just in the middle of the game. Moreover, in order to save the game progress, the player had to find typewriter ink, and it was impossible to save the game without it. Probably otherwise, it would have been necessary to make records with their own blood, but the developers were loyal to the player. There were many rooms in the mansion, and many of them were visually inspired by the Overlook Hotel, the setting for the 1980 horror film The Shining. There were opponents everywhere. In the house, for example, there was a hunter who jumped out at the player unexpectedly. This character was inspired by the cult image of a monster from a horror film popular in those years.
テキサスチェーンソーズマサカーは影響を受けましたね。あそこら辺の一番最初に怪しそうなボロボロの家入っていって、でドアかエレベーターみたいなのがバーンと開いて、急にレーザーフェイスでそいつが出てきて、斧かなんかでボンってやって殺すわけじゃないですか。で家畜のように奥の方に引きずっていくっていう、すごく唐突な怖さっていうのをすごく僕は好きでしたね。
It's interesting that initially the player's first enemies were supposed to be ghosts, but then Shinji replaced them with zombies, which were supposed to chase the player from room to room. By the way, there is a legend that the mansion has a real existing prototype. One of the project managers once said in an interview that he often visited the USA and England, where he saw a lot of frightening mansions, and one of them became the prototype of the mansion in the game. Wouldn't want to be in that one. After the mansion, the player fell into the sewers, where the main plot twist was revealed. Found in the caves, Bravo team member Enrico Marini revealed that one of Alpha team members was a traitor. He found evidence that the agent hired by Umbrella Pharmaceuticals was a STARS member sent to the mansion with orders to betray the team as part of a cover-up. But in the course of his investigation, during a search of the underground caves under the mansion, Enrico was injured. However, the player would not be able to save Enrico. His dying words were a warning to the Alpha team, but Marini failed to name the traitor. He was shot by Wesker, who was following his officers. In the end, the traitor turned out to be Albert Wesker, introduced into the STARS squad in order to destroy it. And the brilliant plan of the villain was an experimentally bred monster, a super soldier infected with virus T and immune to infection. They called him the Tyrant, probably to put him on par with Hitler, Mussolini, Putin, and Al-Qaeda.
I expected more.
At the same time, Frankenstein's monster was not particularly grateful to his master, and the fate of Albert Wesker was also sealed. As they say, don't bite the hand that feeds you. If you haven't been following the series since the beginning but have played recent remakes, then you know that in Resident Evil 2, the Tyrant runs after you throughout the game. However, here, you could only fight him at the end of the game. It was also not very easy to defeat him. The flare gun was used for it. The rest of the game without the Tyrant wasn't any easier. The developers deliberately drove the player into tight spaces surrounded by opponents. Mutated dogs often ran out at you, or even zombies. There were not enough cartridges for all the opponents, and sometimes the developers counted on the player's ingenuity. It was possible to hide somewhere or run away from the enemies, and in order to save their partner in the story, the player had to be assiduous and be able to find 3 secret discs. Then, it was possible to pull the second character out of the dungeon. Finally, once you dealt with the Tyrant, all you had to do was hop on a helicopter and fly away, watching the lab explosion from a bird's eye view. This was just one of 7 finals, and to make the player more eager to start the game again and replay after passing, in the character's pockets appeared previously unseen weapons and keys to the wardrobe. There, you could change your character into an unusual look. That would better be the keys to a Ferrari. The game's optimistic ending was overshadowed by the released additional content for the game. During the mission, STARS had the opportunity to show what they were capable of, but as a result of circumstances, they were cut off from weapons and lost a significant part of their detachment, including 2 commanders. All surviving members were in the hospital. The prospect of reorganizing the squad had not yet been decided, and the investigation towards Umbrella couldn't be legally carried out since the mansion, with all the evidence, had been destroyed. Furthermore, it becomes known that as a result, 750 acres of forest, as well as 4 civilian families, 13 people and 7 tourists from other states, were affected. Umbrella lost 25 lab workers, 7 headquarters researchers, 22 Type A experimental objects from which the hunters were created, and 1 Type B experimental object, aka Tyrant. Many factories stopped their work, weapon sales in the city increased, as well as crime rate. An unknown skin disease began to spread throughout the city. The investigation refused to rely on the words of the fighters because they contained the fact of betrayal. which was also impossible to prove. Local authorities and the police refused to press charges against Lord Spencer and the Umbrella Corporation he headed, and given that the survivors were police officers themselves, it would be objectively very difficult to conduct such an investigation under pressure from the Umbrella Corporation. Umbrella refused to take responsibility for the consequences and promised to provide financial support for the city's restoration. Somewhere at this moment, the watershed between the first and second parts of the game passed. Or would it be more correct to say, zombie shed? The games in the Resident Evil series are not the most Easter, but some Easter eggs can still be found in the first part. For example, there is a secret message from Shinji Mikami which can be found by beating the game in invisible mode for 5 hours, where the director thanks the player for completing the game to the very end and speaks of the taste of victory and pain while seeing the inscription, "Game Over." And that games are not just a product of a development company, but also the support and dedication of a player's community. But this is just a secret ending. You have to look for an Easter egg. The fact is that the developers hid it not in the game itself, but in its files. There should be a file called em120d.emd, where next to the Chris Redfield skin, there were images of Mega Man, the main character of another Capcom game series. And besides, have you not noticed that the main character of Resident Evil is not exactly like the character depicted on the game cover? The game's cover designer admitted in an interview that he designed it before the game's release and that it is not based on any of the game's characters. The character on the box art isn't based on anyone in reality, such as an actor. He's roughly based on a character from the game. At the time I did the cover, the game's concept was still developing, so I was told to run with it, but include certain elements like spiders, etc. But damn, he reminds you of someone, especially if you look at the very first cover of the game. Yes, it's Sylvester Stallone from Judge Dredd, and that's not all that leaked from the movie into the game. The scene where the player saw the Tyrant for the first time in the lab used nearly identical footage from 1995's Judge Dredd. But there was also a reference to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Otherwise, where else would this flare gun come from? Chris's design was based on Keanu Reeves in the movie Speed, and the choker around Rebecca's neck was a nod to the movie Leon, where the same choker was worn by Natalie Portman's character Matilda. At the same time, Rebecca in the early versions of the script was called that way. The creators of Resident Evil have been inspired by a lot of horror classics, and in the bird attack scene, you can catch a reference to The Birds, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, and the scene where we watched a terrible shark attack in the first person was a reference to Jaws, directed by Steven Spielberg. The lab self-destruct scene and the in-game design of the flamethrower were references to the movie Alien by Ridley Scott. The game was fun to play, and the tension made the player sweat. The camera in the game constantly occupied the far point of the room, creating the effect of video surveillance and filming. This is what Mikami took from Alone in the Dark, and sometimes, because of this, there were difficulties in fighting and escaping from opponents, but there was an atmosphere of fear and suspense. Basically, everything in the game had its pros and cons. For example, memes were born out of the blue from some game cons. 2 memes are associated with Jill Valentine. Firstly, even the developers joke about the fact that Jill is a master unlocker, inserting a reference to this phrase in another later project of the series. And secondly, Jill, whom Barry leaves a master key to unlock the doors, can accidentally fall into a trap with a falling ceiling. Then Barry suddenly knocks down the door and saves the character, voicing the second meme.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Yes, perhaps the biggest drawback in the game was the poorly structured dialogues and terrible English voice acting. The characters overacted, spoke awkwardly, and gave out some hilarious intonations that did not correspond to what was happening on the screen.
Is this?
That's right. This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant.
It feels like Japanese developers saved on an English tutor, being content with school knowledge. Okay, jokes aside, the fact was that the game didn't have special voice actors for the Japanese market and for the American market. Since it was the first game in the series that no one really bet on success, the studio was saving money where it could. During one of the gaming conferences, Barry's voice actor, Barry Jared, commented on the reason why the voice acting was so bad. The thing was that the actors were given replicas and told to make approximately 6 variations of each. At the same time, the actors did not know the context of the scene, so when they sent their lines to Capcom, the choices that the studio made in Japan were the ones that sounded familiar and best to the ears of the Japanese developers. But those lines sounded very odd to English-speaking users. The actor who played Albert Wesker, Pablo Kuntz, admitted that the original script was written in Japanese and then translated directly into English, which caused some of the dialogue lines to sound unnatural. For example, a line Wesker says is, "Stop it, don't open that door." If it were written like "Stop, don't open that door," then it would have read differently. During the first game recording, Resident Evil did not have a director to guide the actors in terms of how they wanted the characters to sound. Furthermore, according to Pablo, the actors were only given a brief description of the characters and heroes' traits. There was little to no context to Resident Evil's story, so most of the actors just read the script the way it was written. All this gave Resident Evil a hit in the Guinness Book of Records for the most terrible dialogues. Despite the fact that the game is almost 3 decades old, it was only a few years ago that Pablo first learned about his role in the game and heard how his character sounded. The actor immediately saw countless memes created by fans commenting on how unnatural the voice acting in the game was, and decided to recreate this voice acting. Well, that is, to cringe.
That's right. This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant.
So my voice has kind of gone a little bit deep in that one. So we'll try this one here. Okay, here we go. So that's right. This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant.
Fortunately, unlike the voice acting, the music was on top. Although, wait, we'll talk about this later. Anyway, the game was very acclaimed by critics and players, and it was from it that survival horror, a whole genre of such games, was born and successfully exists to this day. Soon its success will be repeated by Dead Space, which will also grow into a full-fledged universe, as well as Alone in the Dark, Silent Hill, Amnesia, Outlast, and many others. If you are interested in learning more about the story of the iconic Dead Space, write in the comments below this video. We will gladly take it into consideration. Resident Evil was the best-selling PlayStation 1 game in 1997, despite the fact that the international version outside of Japan was slightly censored, as we discussed earlier. Some moments from the intro were cut out, and the video itself was made in black and white. Auto-aim was removed, which made it easier to shoot at opponents so that players in America would buy the game instead of renting it. The fact is that the rental did not bring profit to the developers, and besides, it was temporary, and the auto-aim greatly accelerated the game's passage. If you wanted to go through the game quickly and have fun, be kind to buy it. However, in September 1997, the company released Resident Evil Director's Cut, in which the camera position was changed, the appearance of the characters was slightly updated, and difficulty levels were added to the game. Really complex levels of difficulty. In addition, auto-aim has returned to the game for Western audiences. The Director's Cut was released on several platforms at once, including the PC version, and for console fans, a version with DualShock support was released separately. And here, it is worth mentioning the music. Junko Tamiya's original tracks have been replaced with music by composer Mamoru Samuraguchi, who was rumored to be deaf. According to him, he was helped to make music by another person, and the idea was simply to replace the soundtrack with a darker and more frightening one. It is not known whether he listened to what they did, but the music was disgusting. Meanwhile, Director's Cut was included in the PlayStation Classic line and most recently made available on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5, remastered in HD. It soon became known that the CGI cutscenes in the game were created from polygons on Silicon Graphics computer systems using 3D soft image processing software, and the whole process of creating the game took place on this device. For 1996, the game was a technological breakthrough and owes it to Yasuhiro Ampo and Jun Takuchi. Besides, about 50 Capcom employees worked on the game, and this is, for a second, almost 70% of the entire team. Furthermore, Resident Evil Remake was released in 2002, which expanded the original and slightly corrected all the shortcomings, as well as interestingly made a connection to almost all the games in the series that were released at that time. It was that remake that would be re-released in HD format on current platforms in 2014. But due to the name on the packaging, many were sure that this was the remaster of the original and not the remake, and missed its release. Moreover, in 2002, the project was exclusive to the Nintendo GameCube platform. But we will talk about this and other remakes of the series in another video, so if you're interested, like this video and write in the comments if you are waiting for our video on Resident Evil remakes. Also, in 2006, to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the series, Resident Evil Deadly Silence was released and ported to the Nintendo DS. It included Classic Mode, the original game with minimal enhancements and mechanics of later parts, Quick Turn, Tactical Reload, touchscreen support, as well as respawn mode featuring more enemies and a series of new puzzles that take advantage of the platform's capabilities. Character and enemy models have also been improved with better textures and new exclusive clothing. Balenciaga? Gucci? Well, not that exclusive. The studio will not immediately realize that fans still love the original and that there will always be new users who have not yet played the first Resident Evil. The company did not expect special success from the game, but they were wrong. Users praised the game for its innovation, detailed graphics, and dark atmosphere. Resident Evil won the 1996 Game of the Year award. Still, 2.5 million copies of sales in those years were not empty words. Shinji Mikami quickly became a famous and recognizable game designer all over the world and was practically considered the founding father of the survival horror genre. Studio Capcom took up the development of the continuation of the sensational game. Both Mikami and Capcom expected changes in the future, but we will talk about this in the second part of our nostalgic journey into the past of the Resident Evil series. In the meantime, you can support its release by subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell so as not to miss the release of the continuation. Be sure to like this video, because only in this way we can evaluate your interest in continuing. Thank you for watching this video until the end. It was PressX. See you soon.